The Aussie NFL Fantasy Show would like to acknowledge the traditional land owners and the leaders past, present and emerging of Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Darawal countries where we are working from today. This always was, and always will be, Aboriginal land.
The number one Australian-made fantasy football podcast. The guys are the absolute best in the industry, delivering top-shelf content every single week. Make sure to stop by and check out Manjot, giving out his fresh pastries to the previous week's top performers. While you're there, make an appointment with Taylor for Dr. Goodcall to predict some wholesome fantasy starters for the current week. Then check in to see Matty C putting the guys through their paces in Fantasy Cliffhanger, before finally listening to the guys battle it out in Starts of the Week. You can find them on all social media platforms. YouTube, their handle is youtube.com/@Aussie NFL Fantasy. Twitter, it's at Aussie_fantasy. Instagram, Aussie NFL Fantasy. TikTok, at Aussie NFL Fantasy. As well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now, back to the show. So for episode 5, I'm going to dive into my tier update. We are 1 week later than what I'd hoped to do. So obviously we try to do it every 3 weeks. We've had a 4-week break in between the last one. Unfortunately, I just had commitments last week I couldn't get out of. So we'll touch on an overall update there. We will also break down some positions this week, which will be nice. We can look at sort of what quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, and tight ends are starting to trend or drop off. And then the second half of the episode, we will be looking at some college names to watch. So what college players are starting to trend, who's starting to emerge as dark horses, who can we look at come draft season. So this is going to be a fairly popular topic as the weeks go on, when we start getting to declarations and combine. So look forward to starting that process with you all. And we'll kick into our first segment. So for our Week 10 tier update, we're going to jump through some of the overall movers, and then we'll go through by position. So let's get started. So we've seen another round of fairly sizable movements. For those that have tuned in to both the Week 3 and Week 6 updates, where I've sort of just done the overall, we see a lot at the top end, and particularly there's been a lot of movement around running backs, sort of ebbs and flows. Week 3 to Week 6, there was a fair drop-off, and then it sort of started to rebound. So let's dive in. So we've seen Christian McCaffrey go from Tier 2 back to Tier 1. So for those that tuned into the previous two, you'll know that he went from Tier 1 down to Tier 2, and then he's rebounded. Obviously, the move to the 49ers has helped recover some value that he held at the start of the season. Stephon Diggs has jumped from Tier 3 to Tier 2. Kenneth Walker has had a fairly sizable jump. He's gone from Tier 4 to Tier 2. So for those that tune into the Aussie NFL Fantasy Show, highly recommend it. If you don't, subscribe and download. The guys are amazing. I joined in one of their episodes at the start of the season for a Bold Takes episode. And I mentioned there I was pretty harsh. I've been pretty harsh on Breece Hall all through the pre-draft process and start of the season. The hype the guy was getting, I thought, was a bit out of control, considering the sort of system he was in to what he was coming into with the Jets. I'm happy to take an L on that one. You've always got to call your shots, and that one, unfortunately, I got wrong for me. I always felt like Kenneth Walker, and my personal favourite was Isaiah Spiller. Now, I'm not quite sure what's going on there. That's, for a future episode, but Kenneth Walker, I thought, had a good shot to do fairly well. So really good to see him start to come into a lot of value. And obviously his usage has gone up now that he's got the primary role. So 2 tier jumps for him. Travis Etienne has had a similar jump where he's gone from Tier 5 to Tier 3. So again, you get James Robinson out of town and it's Travis's role. And he always had the talent to do that. So it's really good to see him coming to that kind of value. Tyreek Hill is up from Tier 4 to Tier 3, as is Javonte Williams. Debo's had a slight drop from Tier 3 to Tier 4. Chris Olave is up from Tier 5 to Tier 4. And Najee Harris has continued to drop. For those that tuned into the earlier episodes, he went from Tier 2 to Tier 3. And I think it was in my week 6 update, I predicted that based on his upcoming schedule, and then the defenses that he was going to come up against, he'd continue to slide, and he's done that. So unfortunately, he's dropped from tier 3 to tier 5. Now, if you actually watch that Pittsburgh offense, there's not a lot to get excited about. I think there's obviously brighter days ahead. I think they'll work that out. Kenny Pickett's not terrible, but yeah, it might take another season, off season, to really try and I guess sort out their issues, and hopefully Najee can start to bounce back into some good value. Dameon Pierce, Josh Jacobs, Devonta Smith, and Lamar Jackson are all up from tier 6 to tier 5, and Ramondre Stevenson has jumped from tier 2, jumped 2 tiers, sorry, from tier 7 to tier 5. So a lot of really big movements in this one. And now we'll dive into the individual positions. So now we'll dive into each individual position. Starting with quarterback, we've seen Jalen Hurts go from tier 2 to tier 1. We've seen Justin Fields and Tua Tagovailoa go from tier 3 to tier 2. And Zach Wilson's come from tier 4 up to tier 3. Now, the odd one out of the bunch is obviously Zach Wilson. I mean, if you look at how the Jets have been performing, they've been very much run heavy and defense oriented, where Wilson hasn't had a lot of contribution to, I guess, the win streak that they were on. That they've been on. So that for me is a pretty interesting one. I'll deep dive on him a little later just to see whether that's something that potentially could go, could maintain. Next, we'll have a look at running backs, and we'll start off with DeAndre Swift, who's dropped from a tier 1 to a tier 2. No real movement at the top end of this position. Kenneth Walker, Travis Etienne, Dameon Pierce, Ramondre Stevenson, and Josh Jacobs have all climbed from tier 4 up to tier 3. And we've seen Nick Chubb, Joe Mixon, and Najee Harris all drop from tier 2 to tier 3. So this one for me was quite interesting with the amount of players that have sort of been moving around in the last couple of weeks. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And as I mentioned earlier in my overall, we've seen a lot of movement in running backs, both for and against, and I guess adds to the volatility of the position. Not necessarily as volatile as I would say maybe tight end in terms of just scoring fluctuation. It's more players sort of coming in and out of game scripts. But just some interesting finds there. Next, we'll dive into wide receivers and a little tamer here. So we've seen Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams jump from tier 3 to tier 2. Cooper Kupp, who's dropped from tier 1 to tier 2. Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Chris Godwin have all gone from tier 4 to tier 3. So not as much movement here. The position's been fairly stable all season. I guess if you've got a receiver that's in a good situation and they're getting a healthy share of targets, you've probably been on a bit of a winner. And finally, we'll finish off with tight end. And this one was, I almost didn't bother with this one. There's only been one mover, and that's Greg Dulcich, and he's gone from tier 4 to tier 3. Otherwise, the position in terms of value really hasn't moved, and it sort of adds to a lot of the pre-draft. If you invest heavily in one of the top tier tight ends, it's great. You've got a bonus at that position over potentially most of your league mates. But if you leave it till a little bit later, and maybe even try to stream the position, or on your dynasty roster, if you've got sort of a mid-tier option, and then you just try and sort of hit one out of each draft until you land a good one. It's a little trickier, I guess, to manage that position, but yeah, not a lot of movement there. So that'll about wrap us up for this week's tier update. As a lot of really cool movement in this one. I endeavour to try and keep to the 3 weeks, because I just feel like that'll give us enough updates throughout the season. So I'll try and drop the next one in. I'll check it at 12 weeks, and if we've had a bit of movement, I'll do one. If not, I might leave it for a little bit longer and try and get back on track with that. Next segment, we're going to dive into some college names and players to watch, and just get some guys on your radar nice and early. So for our college names to watch in today's episode, we're just going to stay fairly top line to start with, because obviously there's a lot of information we don't have. Declarations haven't been made yet, so a lot of these players could actually go back to school if they're eligible to do so. So I'll just run through the way too early top 10 2023 draft prospects in terms of ranking. So we've got Will Anderson, edge rusher from Alabama; Bryce Young, quarterback, Alabama; CJ Stroud, quarterback, Ohio State; Jalen Carter, defensive line, Georgia; Will Levis, quarterback, Kentucky; Peter Skronowski, offensive tackle, Northwestern; Oluwumuyiwa Fashion. I apologize, that's terrible. Offensive tackle, Penn State. I got to get better at some of these names, but that's a tricky one. Michael Mayer, tight end, Notre Dame; Jared Verse, edge rusher, Florida State; Keely Ringo, cornerback, Georgia. So a lot of quarterbacks in this draft, and that was the tip coming into this year, is there would be a much better quarterback. This is a much better quarterback draft than last year. Last year's prospects were fairly weak, as we can see this year. No one's really taken hold of that position in their various teams that they were drafted by. In the interests of fantasy, though, I will get one of the guys from the Aussie NFL Fantasy Show. I'll get Manjot on to talk IDP. So some of these defensive players, you might come up there. But in the interests of just trying to stay really top line today for our very first one, we're just going to do quarterbacks. And we'll just run through four today. So when we're looking specifically at quarterbacks, we'll start with Bryce Young, ranked first overall at the position. 6 foot high, 194 pounds. He has played 9 games so far this season, 2,443 passing yards, 63% completion, 22 touchdowns, and 4 intercepts. Great athlete. Alabama quarterbacks typically don't transition well. I mean, Tua's probably the only hope for the team to this point. But before him, there just hasn't been a lot. So Bryce Young, great prospect. See how that goes. CJ Stroud, Ohio State, ranked second at the position, 6'3", 218 pounds. He's played 10 games, 2,750 passing yards, 67.1% completion, 34 touchdowns, and 4 intercepts. So he's probably, my opinion, and I've seen this opinion a fair bit in various forums, CJ Stroud is probably the better quarterback. Pure quarterback. May not be as athletic as, say, Bryce Young, but in saying that, if he does declare and he goes to the right system, he could quite easily be the first player picked if the team with the first overall pick is in need of a quarterback and someone that can pretty much start straight away. Absolutely such a good prospect. I'm looking really forward to diving into some scouting notes with him during the off-season. So I think that'll be a fun one. The next one we'll do is Will Levis, quarterback, Kentucky, ranked third at the position, 6'3", 232 pounds. He's played 9 games, 2,012 passing yards, 66.1% completion, 16 touchdowns, and 9 intercepts. So interesting prospect. He's a senior, so he's had a little bit more college experience than the first two, who are both juniors. He will be another one that'd be good to dive into the scouting report just to see sort of what his trajectory is. So how he's performed so far through his college career, and I guess what sort of team he would be suited to. I feel like, without really diving into a lot on him, he's not standing out as a terrific passer I haven't got his rushing numbers, so that'll be interesting to dive into to see whether the athleticism can make up the difference. But anyway, we'll do a bit more of a deep dive on him in the coming weeks. And the last guy I really want to touch on has really started to come into conversation. That's Hendon Hooker, quarterback, Tennessee, ranked 6th at the position, 6'4", 218 pounds. He's played 10 games, 2,888 passing yards, 71.1% completion, 24 touchdowns and 2 intercepts. So in terms of just pure yards and completion, he's the pick of the bunch so far. The interesting thing about Hooker is that he's also a senior, but he's 25 years old, so he's actually going to be older than a lot of starting quarterbacks that have come out in the last year and the year before. So, again, I think he's a really interesting mix of he can hit almost all parts of the field. Great height, great weight, so strong kid. So it'd be interesting to see through. Obviously, he will declare through the process of where he gets mocked to, because I think that's going to be very important to him, because he's a lot older than your typical rookie. He's not going to have to go through a lot of the growing pains that some of these kids are when, they come into a whole bunch of money and all these people, they become famous, and it'll just be really interesting to see how he handles that being a lot older. And he's one that definitely I've put on my board nice and early. He shouldn't be at the top. He won't be at the top of the draft, but he's one in a lot of rookie drafts. If you need a second quarterback, or if you've got an aging quarterback and you just want to have someone there that isn't going to be super expensive, that allow you to put your assets into something else, Hendon Hooker could be a really good option for you. So again, you're looking really forward to diving into his scouting notes, because I think they're going to be important, and then obviously where he's going to be mocked to, because I'll throw a name out. If he was to go to Atlanta, for example, that could actually be a really good spot for him. He's got some some weapons there, and they've got the ability to add more. So, they lose Calvin Ridley, but they've got decent compensation for him. Kyle Pitts would be a great target for him. And I think I'm just probably going to leave it at that for today. What I'll look to do is, in the coming weeks, we'll add each position. I'll do a bit more of a deep dive on them, on each of the important stats to fantasy, and we'll see if we can just start dragging out a couple of these names that you can just mark off. Obviously, you can have the guys at the top of the board, and if you dive into your forums, you'll see the guys that everyone's talking about. But we'll dig a little deeper down the list and just see if we can find guys that are just showing it a couple of interesting things. That maybe you can just put a circle around, and if you're in your third or fourth round and you've got an extra roster spot or two, might be worth a dart throw. So, look, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Always appreciate your downloads and listening in, and I really hope you get something out of this. As I said, I've said this a couple of times. I try to put out content that's a little different to what other podcasts are. Looking for more instructional stuff, and if anyone has if you're listening and you have feedback, or if there's something that you would like to hear covered, or some content that you'd like some sort of input on, please reach out at No Huddle Dynasty on Twitter. I've just joined Instagram, so I've just become a big boy. No Huddle Dynasty on there. Please feel free to reach out, send questions. Please give me a follow, and I will look forward to putting out another episode next week. Thanks, guys.